case of Ursula and Sabina Ericson. The story begins on the morning of May 17, 2008. Inspectors from the Birmingham Road Service, monitoring video footage from road cameras in London, spotted two women walking on the median strip of the busy M6 motorway. The police were called to deal with the unusual situation, and a film crew from a morning news program also attended the scene. They thought the women might be eccentric, drunk, or under the influence of drugs. As the patrol car carrying police and journalists arrived at the scene, a radio message reported that one of the women had left the median strip and walked into the road, where she was hit by a car. At the time, no one knew how serious her injuries were, but those present began to realize that the story was becoming increasingly complicated. When the reporters arrived, they saw other patrol officers, who had arrived a little earlier, talking to the strange women on the side of the road. Neither of the women appeared to be injured. Only later did it become clear that one of the women had actually been hit by a car on the road. Fortunately, there were no serious injuries. The twins looked quite normal. They were not shaking or screaming, and they were listening and occasionally looking around. The reporters began filming the police explaining the incident on camera when suddenly something happened that even eyewitnesses could hardly believe. One of the sisters, Ursula, suddenly threw her bag onto the asphalt and ran into the street just as a large truck had passed. The patrol officer tried to stop her by grabbing her coat sleeve, but his efforts were in vain. In a state of obvious distress, she ran forward and took off her coat, which the police were holding. The truck was approaching, and she ducked down and crawled under its wheels. Although the truck driver reacted quickly, he could not stop in time. The truck rolled over Ursula's leg, breaking it. She screamed, then fell silent and lay motionless on the road. Overwhelmed by the scene, all the passers-by rushed to her aid. At that moment, Sabina Ericson, who was standing on the side of the road, seized the opportunity when the police were distracted. She rushed into the road after her sister and was hit head-on by a Volkswagen, which threw her a considerable distance. It was hard to comprehend this surreal situation. The two women looked so much alike and seemed to be facing death at such a young age, lying on the road just 3 meters apart. Despite their serious injuries, both were still alive. Ursula had a broken pelvis and both legs. Sabina and Ursula said nothing, only groaning softly in pain. When they regained their composure, they both tried to stand up despite their injuries, ignoring everyone's pleas for them to stay still until the ambulance arrived. At this point, they began to swear. The sisters then fought back against the patrol officers as if the police were their worst enemies. Traffic on the freeway was stopped, and an ambulance helicopter was called to pick up the injured. Witnesses believed that Ursula and Sabina were under the influence of heavy drugs, which seemed to be the only explanation for their strange behavior. Both appeared to feel no pain and were very aggressive toward the police. The sisters appeared confused about their surroundings and what had happened. Sabina suddenly stood up. Despite having been hit by a car, she appeared unharmed. Instead, she exhibited a strong urge to escape. She seemed completely oblivious to her injuries, demonstrating incredible stamina as she tried to move away. A policewoman tried to calm Sabina by holding her hand, but Sabina responded by turning around and pushing the officer away. Sabina then attempted to evade the police's grasp. After taking off her coat, she assumed a fighting stance, ready for confrontation. At this point, the police had to step in to assist. A driver who was watching the scene saw Sabina being restrained and forced into the police car. During the struggle, she screamed angrily and fought back violently as if she were fighting for her life. Ursula repeatedly called the police, insisting, "Police, I recognize you. You are not real police officers." Although some police officers showed her their badges, Ursula remained aggressive and tried to fight the ambulance staff. She bit their hands and attempted to resist. After being injected with a strong sedative, she calmed down, allowing them to take her to the helicopter. At this point, everyone concluded that Ursula and Sabina Ericson had used a hallucinogen. Both women were airlifted to the nearest hospital. Ursula underwent surgery to remove her ruptured spleen and suffered multiple fractures to her spine, pelvis, and both legs. Doctors, on the other hand, found no serious injuries on Sabina. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. Let's continue. By this time, about 5 hours had passed since the accident. Sabina had calmed down considerably and appeared happier, with no signs of aggression as before. She answered some questions but remained silent on others and made no attempt to fight back or escape. Overall, she behaved normally and appropriately. The officers who came to arrest her were surprised by what they encountered. Sabina's demeanor was now completely different. Before them stood a gentle, quiet blonde woman in a hospital gown, who followed them to the police car without resistance. After placing her in the back seat, they chose not to handcuff Sabina. When she arrived at the station, she chatted about the weather, laughed, joked, and even flirted with the officers. She allowed them to search her without protest. This behavior seemed unbelievable because just hours earlier, she had appeared ready to unleash her fury on anyone who came near her. Because her communication style had changed so dramatically, the officers did not attempt to calm her down and began to treat her normally. The police tried to talk to Sabina to find out more details, but strangely, she seemed to have forgotten everything that had happened. She showed no interest in her younger sister Ursula and did not ask about her. Instead, Sabina frequently looked at her reflection, was preoccupied with her appearance, and searched for her clothes and jewelry. When asked about her behavior, she would either remain silent or tell the police that she did not remember. Sabina insisted that she had never intended to harm herself or anyone else. Ultimately, the interrogation yielded no results. Later, tests confirmed that neither Ursula nor Sabina Ericson had any traces of drugs or alcohol in their systems. There was nothing suspicious about Sabina's home, and the police found no evidence that either sister had ever used or purchased hard drugs. Sabina faced charges of assaulting a police officer and causing a public nuisance, while Ursula appeared to have avoided any legal consequences. However, the police were surprised by a call from Sabina's husband, who had no idea where his wife was or what had happened. The police who took up the sisters' case were left stunned by the twins' unpredictable behavior. After speaking to Sabina on the day of the incident, police and psychiatrists concluded that, despite her previous condition on the M6, she was now mentally stable. She was aware of her surroundings, understood who was with her, and accurately assessed herself, the time, and her environment. Most importantly, she was stable and posed no danger to herself or others. Incredibly, her previous bouts of insanity on the highway were temporary, and there was no longer any reason to diagnose or commit Sabina to a psychiatric facility. Sabina was detained before her trial. On May 19, 2008, her trial took place. Sabina Ericson was found sane and admitted to assaulting a police officer and causing a dangerous situation on the road. The court fined her and sentenced her to 1 day in jail, which she had already served in pretrial detention. Sabina and Ursula were then released. Although just days earlier, Sabina had deliberately thrown herself in front of a car and violently attacked a police officer. No one could explain her sudden bout of insanity, but everyone believed that it had been completely normal. This meant that she was free to go wherever she wanted. During this time, police began to piece together the events leading up to the M6 motorway incident. The twin sisters, Sabina and Ursula, were born in March 1967 in the Swedish city of Sunne. They were not the only children. They had an older sister and an older brother. Ursula and Sabina, along with their relatives, remained in contact with each other. However, Ursula and Sabina Ericson had not seen each other for 8 years until the day before the traffic accident on May 16, 2008. On that day, Ursula flew from the United States to visit Sabina, who lived in Mallow, County Cork, Ireland, with her husband and 2 children. Ursula then stayed at her house. The next day at 2 a.m., the sisters secretly boarded a ferry to Liverpool, England, with their own motives. Upon arrival, they deliberately went to the police station. In subsequent interviews, the sisters did not explain why they had left Ireland for England. According to police reports, at around 8:30 a.m. on May 16, 2008, they went to Liverpool police station and claimed that Sabina's children, who lived in Mallow, were in danger. The sisters' story was so chaotic and disorganized that the police could not understand it at first. After hearing their agitated account, the officers became suspicious and attempted to verify their claims. They contacted the Dublin police, who were responsible for maintaining order in Mallow. They discovered that the previous night, neighbors had called the police to Sabina Ericson's home due to loud shouting and arguments within the family. It was revealed that the couple had not only argued but had also been seriously fighting. The police tried to calm Sabina Ericson and her husband by warning them about the potential consequences of their argument. The tension seemed to ease, and the officers decided to leave. However, no one knew what happened next in the house. After discussing the situation with colleagues in Dublin, the Liverpool police realized they were dealing with a distressed woman facing marital problems. Due to the expense and complexity of intervening in personal matters, the police advised Sabina to calm down and return to her children. Despite this advice, Ursula and Sabina Ericson did not return to their home in Mallow. Instead, at 11:30 a.m., they unexpectedly boarded a National Express bus to London. Both sisters were carrying large bags that were difficult to manage. The bus driver informed all passengers that such bags should be stored in the luggage compartment, but the sisters anxiously held on to their bags, refusing to put them away. The driver grew increasingly anxious and began observing them in his rearview mirror. He noticed Ursula and Sabina Ericson's tense demeanor. They kept looking around and seemed to be planning something. Most notably, they clutched their bags tightly as if they were their only hope of survival. After safely arriving at the nearest intercity bus station, the driver dropped Ursula and Sabina Ericson off and reported the incident to the station manager. The manager, following protocol, immediately contacted the police, informing them that there were 2 women at her station who might have bombs in their bags. When the police arrived and searched the sisters, they found nothing suspicious and considered the call a false alarm. Perhaps if the police had paid more attention to Ursula and Sabina Ericson's mental state, they might have been able to prevent a series of tragic events. However, their main goal was to prevent a potential terrorist attack, not to assess the women's behavior. So the sisters were allowed to leave. For some reason, they were determined to get to London, but they were short on money. It is unclear what they were thinking, but it seems that the only option they considered to reach the British capital was to walk along the median strip of the M6 motorway. They were discovered by a road inspector at 3:20 p.m. that day. The story is not over yet. There is still much to explore. Let's take another look at Sabina. After her release, psychiatrists, police, and judges assessed her and determined that she was no longer a danger to society. When she left court, she was instructed to return home to her husband and children. However, instead of going home, she began wandering around the city, lost in thought. Interestingly, she was wearing her sister's green cardigan, which Ursula had discarded before she was hit by the truck. With the belongings the police had given her in a bag, she wandered into the park, where she met 2 local men, Glenn Hollinshead and his friend Peter. They had just enjoyed a few beers at a nearby bar. Feeling lonely and missing her twin younger sister Ursula, she felt the need to talk to someone. She approached Glenn Hollinshead's dog, stroked its fur, and talked to it. She then turned to the men nearby and began to share her story. She told them that her twin sister had been in a serious car accident and was currently in the hospital. Sabina said that she was alone and without any support. Now she really wanted to find and visit her younger sister Ursula. Tears welled up in her eyes, and Glenn Hollinshead and Peter, moved by her story, expressed their desire to help her. Glenn, a former military doctor known for his kindness and openness, invited Sabina to stay with him for a few days. He promised to help her find her twin sister. Unfortunately, this decision sealed Glenn's fate. The next day, Sabina, whom he had helped, attacked Glenn and tragically killed him in his own home. Around 8 p.m., Glenn's friends came to his house. At first, they chatted normally and drank a few beers together. However, Sabina appeared distressed and anxious, focused on thoughts of Ursula. She was sitting on a chair when she suddenly stood up, looking out into the dark night. Then she hurriedly pulled the curtains shut, seemingly frightened but unable to explain her strange behavior. Over time, Sabina's actions began to seem paranoid. She refused food and drink. Later, Sabina offered cigarettes to Glenn and his friends, but then abruptly snatched them away, insisting that the cigarettes might be poisoned. Just before midnight, Peter decided to leave. What happened between Glenn and Sabina afterward is known only to Sabina. Around noon the next day, Glenn contacted his brother, who worked at the University Hospital of North Staffordshire. Glenn asked his brother to help him find Ursula Ericson, Sabina's sister. Glenn recounted Sabina's story to his brother, but they realized that finding Ursula was a big challenge. After that, there was a gap in the story, and no one knew what happened. At 7:40 p.m. on May 20th, while dinner was being prepared, Glenn left the house to ask a neighbor, Frank Booth, for tea bags, then went back inside. A minute later, he staggered outside, bleeding, and told Frank Booth that Sabina had stabbed him. Glenn then quickly collapsed and died from his injuries. Before he died, Glenn asked Frank Booth to look after his dog. Frank Booth quickly called the police to report the situation. According to the police report, an ambulance arrived at approximately 8 p.m. On the way to Glenn's home, paramedics found a woman standing in the street, holding a hammer and occasionally hitting herself in the head with it. The woman was later identified as Sabina Ericson. Minutes earlier, she had attacked Glenn, causing his death. Several paramedics rushed to check on him, while 2 other paramedics rushed to assist Sabina. At that time, a motorist named Joshua Gradage attempted to wrest the hammer from her hand. While struggling with him, Sabina screamed, took a brick out of her pocket, and hit him in the back of the head, causing him to become dizzy and fall. Paramedics witnessed this strange and frightening development. They quickly understood that they were dealing with a very dangerous person who needed to be restrained and controlled. Although pursuing aggressive individuals was not usually part of their duties, the ambulance crew pursued Sabina in an attempt to subdue her. She moved at incredible speed, evading them and running down the highway. The chase lasted several minutes, and it was soon discovered that she was heading toward a 12-meter high bridge. With a single leap, she reached the railing of the bridge and, without hesitation, jumped, ending one of the strangest and most confusing street chases in British history. Sabina Ericson survived her ordeal. Surprisingly, most people who jump from a bridge die. However, Sabina only suffered 2 broken ankles and a head injury. When she arrived at the hospital, she appeared completely normal, showing no signs of aggression, delirium, or paranoia. It is unclear whether she truly remembered nothing or was just hiding her past. Either way, she remained silent. On June 6, 2008, she appeared in court for her first trial, sitting in a wheelchair. The prosecution presented a long list of charges against her but provided no details about her motives. Sabina's lawyer was equally confused, unable to explain her actions. As a result, both sides quickly reached a settlement, although psychiatrists declared her sane at the time of the murder. Neither Ursula nor Sabina Ericson had a clear motive. How can we explain their actions in just a few days? The lead psychiatrist at the trial told the prosecution that Sabina Ericson was suffering from a delusional disorder caused by excitement at the time of the murder, which may have occurred during a mass psychosis. He confirmed that she is now fully sane during the hearings. Psychiatrists have stated that Sabina suffered from acute polymorphic psychosis during her moments of madness, which was also caused by mass psychosis. In February, a British court convicted Sabina Ericson of several crimes, including the manslaughter of Glenn Hollinshead. Although she admitted her guilt, she claimed that she had no memory of the events, had no malicious intent, and did all this in a state of clouded mind. The judge considered Sabina Ericson's case to be the most difficult he had ever faced. He believed that her guilt in the case was minimal because she was not aware of her actions at the time. He acknowledged that Glenn Hollinshead's family might not be happy with his verdict. However, he based his decision on the understanding that the murder was caused by temporary mental incapacity and that Sabina's level of guilt was low. Therefore, this verdict was not intended to punish Sabina. The actions of the twin sisters, Sabina and Ursula Ericson, were attributed to a phenomenon known as collective schizophrenia, which has different names in many languages. As a result, Sabina Ericson was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Both Ursula and Sabina were affected by their own insanity. This mental state caused Sabina to hear imaginary voices that led her to act strangely. She held false beliefs that she thought were true. In September 2009, Sabina was sent to a regular women's prison. During her time there, she experienced a brief period of erratic behavior, but afterward, she seemed to have no memory of it. Sabina served 2.5 years of her 5-year sentence. She was released early due to an amnesty. Her younger sister Ursula returned to live and work in the United States. After completing her sentence, Sabina returned to live with her husband and children in Ireland. Sabina never revealed why she and her younger sister Ursula were in England, what happened that day on the M6, or what happened to Glenn Hollinshead. Some believe that the criminal justice system failed in the case of Ursula and Sabina Ericson because it did not answer many questions or hold those responsible accountable. Glenn's brother has expressed his disappointment that Sabina Ericson was allowed to go free after committing a serious crime. He believes that Sabina's mental condition should be recognized and treated by professionals. However, psychiatrists seem to dismiss his concerns, stating that there is no reliable diagnostic system for identifying such conditions based on observation alone. Interestingly, the twins' brother disagrees with the court's decision, although his reasons differ from those of Glenn's brother. The twins' brother believes that Ursula and Sabina were not temporarily insane in May 2008. Instead, he argues that they were fleeing a real threat, a man who was chasing and threatening them. Candace Rogers, who went by Candi, was born on July 18, 1949, in the American city of Spokane, Washington. She was the only child in the family, and shortly after her birth, her parents divorced. Her father stayed in the same city, so they spent time together quite often. Candi was a typical, lovely child who enjoyed strolling outside with her friends, spending time in nature, and playing with her dog. She also had dreams of joining the Camp Fire Girls, a popular organization in those days similar to the Boy Scouts, but exclusively for girls. They learned various useful skills, went on hikes, and enjoyed their time together as a group. In 1959, when Candi was 9, she finally had the chance to join this organization, and she was thrilled about it. One of the Camp Fire Girls' responsibilities was selling mints. The organization provided them with boxes of sweets, and they had to go door to door, asking residents to buy them. On Friday, March 6th, Candi was supposed to do this after school. She returned home, had dinner, played with her dog, and around 4 p.m., she took about 8 boxes of mints and headed out. Candi planned to walk through nearby streets and offer sweets to her neighbors. Other girls were also supposed to visit houses in this area, but they had pre-allocated streets to avoid overlapping and offering sweets to the same people. A few hours later, her mom began to worry as Candi still hadn't returned. She was supposed to be home by 6 p.m., but she was clearly delayed. With darkness falling, her mom decided to go out and search. Accompanied by Candi's grandfather, they walked the streets of their neighborhood, but Candi was nowhere to be found. Soon, some family friends and neighbors joined the search, wanting to help. But despite their efforts, they couldn't find any traces of Candi, so her mom decided to call the police. By that time, the streets had already darkened, and it had become increasingly clear that something bad might have happened to Candi. The police quickly joined the search, starting by questioning all the neighbors. They soon discovered that Candi had only sold 1 box of mints. This indicated that something might have happened to her shortly after leaving home. But one resident claimed to have seen the girl on a nearby street around 6:30 p.m. This was weird because, by that time, Candi's mom was already out searching for her. Candi's grandfather also shared strange observations. When he went in search of his granddaughter and arrived on the same street mentioned by the witness who saw the girl, he almost got struck by a speeding car that even hit the curb. Unfortunately, he didn't see the license plate, but remembered it was a green 1953 Ford. Police distributed a description of the car but weren't able to track it. Around 9 p.m., they discovered several mint boxes strewn along the road near a bridge. It was clear that these boxes belonged to Candi, heightening the overall concern. The police focused their search in this area, combing both riverbanks along with a small wooded zone on either side. They scoured the area all night but couldn't locate Candi. By morning, news of Candi's disappearance spread through local newspapers, and soon statewide media started covering the case. In 1959, child disappearances near their homes were unusual because they happened extremely rarely. The residents of Spokane hadn't faced such a case in many years, leaving them deeply disturbed. Early the next day, police ramped up their efforts, deploying more officers. Mounted police, off-road vehicles, and even military personnel scanning the land from helicopters joined the search. Additionally, a vast number of volunteers, both from the city and nearby areas, joined the search efforts. In total, over 1,000 people participated in the search, making it one of the most extensive in the country's history at that time. The search area extended to 11 miles around the girl's home, yet they still couldn't find her. On the same day, another tragic event unfolded. A helicopter involved in the search clipped power lines and crashed, resulting in the loss of 3 out of the 5 crew members. Search efforts persisted for many days, yielding no results. Police officers continued working literally around the clock in multiple shifts, trying their best to locate Candi. Investigators received approximately 750 tips in the initial days of the search, diligently checking each one, but all led to dead ends. 15 days later, 2 military members from the local base went into the woods west of Spokane on a hunting trip. There, they noticed children's shoes on the ground, immediately recalling Candi's disappearance. Many military members had been involved in the search, so they were all well aware of the case. They reported this discovery to the police, who showed the shoes to Candi's grandfather. He confirmed that the shoes indeed belonged to his granddaughter. The police headed to the woods for a search. Within minutes, one of the officers spotted a foot sticking out from the bushes and found the girl's body. She lay amid the underbrush, covered with pine branches. Medical experts determined that the cause of death was strangulation. The perpetrator had used a torn piece of fabric from her skirt for this. Marks on Candi's hands and feet indicated she had been bound, although no ropes were found near the body. They also concluded that the victim had been sexually abused. During the search of the crime scene, police found a green car seat cover nearby, but they couldn't establish whether it had any relevance to the murder. On Candi's clothing, officers noticed a small purple stain that smelled like grape-flavored chewing gum. Yet, once again, they couldn't establish any connection to the case. Lacking any substantial leads that could lead them to the killer, the police tried to find any possible clues. Investigators sifted through incoming tips and explored the possible involvement of hundreds of individuals, neighbors, various suspicious characters, and previously convicted criminals. Soon, they focused their attention on a 50-year-old man named Alfred Graves. The reason he became a suspect was quite peculiar. He took his own life on the same day Candi's body was discovered. He did it right in his car, not far from where the mint boxes were found. He also lived just a few hundred yards from Candi's home. When the police found Alfred's body, they discovered a rope and women's hairpins in his car. Investigators obtained a search warrant for his house, where they found numerous newspaper clippings detailing articles on sexual crimes against women and girls. The police also learned that several women had accused him of harassment, and even his wife admitted suspecting him of Candi's murder. Despite this troubling chain of events, investigators couldn't find any evidence linking Alfred to Candi's murder. They hesitated to clear him of suspicion, but proving his guilt seemed impossible. Detectives delved into other suspects, whose numbers kept growing. Several months after the murder, they had an extensive list of names spanning multiple pages, and the police diligently checked each one. Yet every time they failed to find evidence of their involvement. Later, investigators had another suspect, a serial killer named Hugh Morse. He was arrested in 1961 for a series of crimes, and the reason he became a suspect was pretty interesting. Hugh was known for constantly chewing grape-flavored gum. As we recall, a similar substance was found on Candi's clothes. Another reason to suspect him was that he killed 2 women in Spokane a few months after Candi's death. Hugh began committing crimes pretty early. His first arrest was for assaulting a woman, but he faced no real consequences. He was simply discharged from the army, where he was serving at the time. Later, he committed a series of robberies in Los Angeles and served only 6 months. After his release, he lured 2 8-year-old girls to a secluded area, promising them ice cream. He sexually assaulted them and was arrested once again. Surprisingly, he managed to avoid prison. A medical commission deemed him a psychopath, so he was placed in a mental health facility. After 2 years, doctors believed he was cured and released him. Hugh moved to Spokane, where he started peeping into women's windows. In November 1959, he broke into a 28-year-old woman's home, assaulted, and killed her. 10 months later, he entered a 69-year-old woman's residence, repeating the same actions as with the previous victim. A month later, he assaulted another woman, stabbing her multiple times, but she survived. After these crimes, he left the city and, over the next few months, committed numerous other offenses, attacking women and girls with a knife, sexually assaulting them, and killing 2 more victims. Hugh always traveled between different cities and states until the FBI took on his case. He was added to the list of the country's 10 most wanted criminals and was soon captured. He was sentenced to multiple life terms, and Hugh attempted to end his life in a cell. However, he was saved by the guards and continued to serve his sentence. Detectives in Candi's case repeatedly visited him in prison, but the man denied any involvement. He also went through a polygraph test which indicated he was telling the truth. However, this tool carries no weight in court due to its questionable accuracy. Considering Hugh's biography and the fact that he lived in Spokane at the time of the murder, investigators viewed him as their primary suspect. But he continued to deny any involvement, and the police lacked any evidence linking him to the killing. Later, the police focused on another suspect, a 49-year-old man named Howard Barnett. In February 1960, he was arrested on suspicion of molesting a minor girl. A few days after the arrest, he took his own life in his cell at the Spokane police station. Before this, he wrote a message on the wall in his own blood stating, "I have a sin before the Lord." His wife learned of her husband's arrest only after his death. Speaking to the police, she asked if he killed that girl, referring to Candi. Detectives began investigating his potential involvement, yet once again, they failed to find any evidence of his guilt. Howard remained one of the main suspects, mainly because he lived on the next street to the victims. Over the course of many years, police continued their efforts on this case, gathering new leads and examining other suspects. At one point, a woman contacted them, claiming that on the day Candi disappeared, she saw a green car following the girl. Investigators once again focused their efforts on locating this specific vehicle. However, this didn't lead to any substantial results, though it was strange that this woman chose to reveal this information many years after the crime. In the following decades, this case was reopened from time to time, but detectives always hit a dead end. Interestingly, they not only had to search for new leads but also fend off false confessions. In total, 13 individuals confessed to Candi's murder, but in each case, the police concluded that they were lying. These individuals couldn't provide any information that only the killer would know, often just repeating details from the newspapers. Surprisingly, such behavior is common in high-profile cases. For some reason, people confess to crimes they did not commit. Throughout the time, the police department saw numerous changes in detectives, each hoping to solve this crime. Candi's murder stood out as one of the most prominent. It impacted a significant number of people. Before the murder, parents felt safe letting their children play outside, but after this case, many reconsidered their views on safety. In the early 2000s, this case was reopened once again, and this time, a new detective decided to use modern technologies. Fortunately, in 1959, the police had diligently collected and preserved all the evidence, which allowed experts to find a sample of male semen on Candi's clothing. Considering it had been stored for several decades, examining the sample proved extremely challenging. But after extensive efforts, experts managed to extract a DNA profile. They uploaded it to the FBI database, but unfortunately, there was not a single match. Detectives also cross-examined the profile with samples from numerous suspects, but none of them turned out to be Candi's killer. Throughout all these years, many were convinced that Hugh Morse was behind the crime. However, the forensics indicated he had no connection to this murder. As a result, the investigation once again hit a standstill. The police had a DNA sample from the person who assaulted and killed Candi, but uncovering their identity remained quite a challenge. The case was once again reopened in 2021, and a new detective decided to try genetic genealogy, a method used in cold cases, and the detective hoped it would finally bring closure to one of the longest-standing investigations. He contacted several laboratories specializing in this analysis, but there he was faced with disappointment once again. To utilize this method, experts needed to examine the original DNA sample. Several attempts were made, but each laboratory concluded that the semen sample had degraded too much, so it was impossible to extract the necessary data. The detective turned to a final laboratory, and unexpectedly, there was a long-awaited breakthrough. Using cutting-edge tools, the experts successfully studied the sample, providing the required profile of the perpetrator. They uploaded the profile to genealogical databases, initiating the search for distant relatives of the DNA's owner. Through meticulous efforts examining thousands of individuals, they narrowed down their focus to one specific family. Upon investigating this family, they found that the DNA sample most likely belonged to one of three brothers. However, a new challenge arose as all three were deceased. Nonetheless, the experts and the detectives discovered that one of the brothers had a daughter, and the police contacted her. The woman was shocked at the possibility of her father being the killer of a little girl. Yet, without hesitation, she agreed to assist. She provided her own DNA sample, and the experts confirmed that she was closely related to the individual whose semen was found on Candi's clothing. With these results, detectives swiftly obtained a court order for the exhumation of her father's grave. Experts extracted a DNA profile from his remains, and after 62 years since the murder, the identity of the perpetrator was finally revealed. It was a man named John Hoff. The analysis revealed a complete match between John's DNA and the semen found on Candi's clothing. Despite having hundreds of suspects throughout the years, John Hoff was never on that list. Investigating his biography, detectives discovered his involvement in other crimes. At the time of Candi's murder, he was 20 years old and lived less than a mile from her house. He also served in the army, stationed at a base near where the girl's body was discovered. 2 years after the murder, he attacked a woman, bound and sexually assaulted her, and attempted to kill her, but she managed to survive. John was arrested and sentenced to only 6 months in prison. He was also disgracefully discharged from the army. Upon release, John started a family, having 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. He remained off the police radar, living a seemingly ordinary life. John changed jobs several times, and once, while working in a food packaging plant, he suffered a severe chemical burn to his face, leaving a lasting mark. His life came to an end in June 1970, 11 years after Candi's murder, when John took his own life without leaving a note. Police also determined that the victim might have known him. Candi was friends with his sister, who was 10 years old at the time. All these years later, she told detectives that after her friend's murder, she cried in her brother's arms, unaware that he was the one who killed Candi. Unfortunately, the girl's parents did not live to see the moment when the killer's identity became known. Candi's mother passed away in February 2006, and her father took his own life in 1963, 4 years after the tragic event. The reason for this remains unknown, leaving only speculation that he couldn't cope with the loss of his own daughter. Nevertheless, this case was finally solved, marking it as one of the longest investigations. Over 62 years, it involved not just different detectives, but different generations. During the press conference where the police announced the name of the killer, only one officer who worked on the investigation in 1959 was present. He thanked God, allowing him to live such a long life and eventually learn the truth. As for John's daughter, initially, she couldn't believe that her father committed such a heinous crime. Later, she accepted this fact, calling her father a monster who took the life of an innocent girl. She expressed regret that he was not held accountable during his lifetime. Interestingly, John took his own life exactly when his daughter turned 9, the same age as Candi. Whether there's any connection remains unknown, and we may never find out. The case of Sarah Raras. Sarah grew up with her sister Nancy in a military family. Their father was an Air Force officer, so the family moved frequently. When Sarah was 6 years old, they relocated to New Mexico, where she started school. IQ tests revealed that she was exceptionally intelligent, particularly in mathematics and the sciences. She was charming, energetic, smiling, and sociable. In the 1980s, she graduated from high school and went on to attend the University of Mines in New Mexico, where she earned a scholarship. Although Sarah lived away from her family, she maintained a close relationship with Nancy, who lived an hour's drive away. Sarah often visited her relatives on weekends. During her time at university, she met a young man named Paul Cohen. After graduating with a bachelor's degree, Sarah and Paul got married. She then pursued a master's degree and hoped to find her own job. However, everything changed when Paul accepted a job with a government agency in Washington, and they moved there. As a result, Sarah had to drop out of school and now lived a 30-hour drive away from her family. Soon after, Sarah found work as an intern at the National Security Agency, where she worked on decrypting classified information. She was known for being a responsible employee. Meanwhile, she was also writing a book about a murder investigation, as she had a passion for detective stories. At work, she became friends with a colleague named Laura Billiter. They spent a lot of time together socializing with other colleagues. Laura had a family and children, and Sarah, too, wanted to become a mother. However, after 3 years of marriage, Sarah and her husband Paul began to drift apart. Finally, in 1990, Sarah began studying at Johns Hopkins University, a prestigious research institution. She had to take evening classes while working full-time during the day. During her studies, she met a 25-year-old named Lorenzo Raras. He was intelligent, sociable, and worked at a local telecommunications company. He came from a Filipino family. They developed a close relationship and decided to get married. On September 7, 1994, Sarah celebrated her 31st birthday and earned her master's degree. She and her husband Lorenzo bought a house in a small town in Maryland. At the age of 33, Sarah became pregnant, and in July 1997, they welcomed a son named Will. During this time, the family moved again, which created more distance between Sarah and her own family. As a result, Sarah relied on support from Lorenzo's family, particularly his mother, Emilia Domingo Raras, who worked in a nursing home and often took Will with her. Although Sarah developed a good relationship with her husband's family, she felt that her husband Lorenzo did not pay enough attention to Will or to her. Lorenzo, on the other hand, began to feel jealous of Will, thinking that Sarah was focusing too much on their child. He started to believe that Sarah was using him just to have a baby. As they grew apart, Lorenzo stopped taking the antidepressants prescribed by his psychiatrist. With the changes in their relationship, he began exercising more control over Sarah. Sarah then asked her mother-in-law, Emilia, for help. But Emilia refused to intervene in her son's marriage. This left Sarah feeling stuck and without a clear way forward. In June 1998, Sarah filed for divorce from her husband Lorenzo, and he moved out of the house just a few days later. During this time, she focused on caring for their child while managing her job. A nanny took care of her son while she was at work, and occasionally, she would bring him to visit Lorenzo and Emilia. She also developed an interest in horseback riding, pausing her detective novel after completing 3 chapters. The divorce proceedings dragged on due to disagreements between the two parties. By December 3, 1998, it was crucial to establish who would have custody of their son, as Lorenzo had started fighting for custody. Tragically, Sarah would not live to see the outcome of this decision. On Friday, November 13, 1998, she dropped her son Will off at Lorenzo's. The next day, she spent time shopping with her friend Laura. They planned to call each other on Sunday morning, but Sarah never made the call. Laura tried calling Sarah and found that her friend had left her a message the day before, but she didn't pay attention to it right away. She expected Sarah to explain where she had been. However, instead, she heard a terrifying 40-second audio. Right from the start of the recording, there were loud noises, followed by frantic female screams. a crash as if the phone had fallen, sounds of a struggle, and then a heavy cough and wheezing. Terrified, Laura called Sarah's number, but there was no answer. The line was busy. She spent several hours unsuccessfully trying to reach Sarah. In the evening, Laura called the county police department. She told them that Sarah might be in danger and described what she had heard over the phone, asking them to conduct an investigation. When the police arrived, they immediately noticed a broken window in Sarah's house where she lived with her son. The officers entered the house through the front door and immediately heard the alarm sounding. This seemed odd because a broken window should have set off the alarm. When they checked the living room, they found Sarah Raras, 30 years old, lifeless. She was lying on the floor in an unusual position, amidst a large pool of blood. However, her child was nowhere to be seen. Sarah had been tortured and had numerous abrasions, primarily on her stomach, chest, and neck, which were the areas that received the most severe blows. Forensic experts estimated that Sarah had died approximately 24 hours prior. After the attack, it appeared that someone had searched the house, as several items were missing. However, many valuables were left untouched, leading the police to believe that the crime was staged. Forensic experts later discovered bloody footprints leading from Sarah's body to the broken window. This indicated that the perpetrator had entered and exited through that window. It was also an ideal hiding place since there was a dense forest behind the house. There was immediate suspicion that the killer knew Sarah. He walked around the house and knew where to go, showing familiarity. The brutality of the act suggested personal motives driven by anger and hatred. The size of the bloody footprints suggested that the shoes were worn by a man, and numerous smudged handprints were found, though no clear fingerprints were recovered, indicating that the attacker likely wore gloves. Forensic experts searched for any additional blood traces left by the killer. Furthermore, during the investigation, they found a large machete with blood on the blade and handle in the yard of the house. That same evening, Laura arrived at Sarah's house and was shocked to see the police cordoning off the area. She became even more panicked when she learned about Sarah's fate. From that moment on, she worried about the well-being of the boy, Will, but the police had no information to share. Later, it was revealed that Will was supposed to be with his father, Lorenzo, at that time. Officers interviewed neighbors in hopes of finding any suspicious activity. Unfortunately, aside from a machete that was sent for analysis, they found no useful evidence. The next day, the entire neighborhood, including Sarah's colleagues, learned about the tragic incident at her house. Sarah's family, living 1,000 kilometers away in Alabama, was also notified. The news hit her sister Nancy the hardest. Experts analyzed a recording of a phone message and confirmed it contained sounds of violence. Detectives reported that the attack occurred shortly after a window was broken. Sarah attempted to call emergency services but accidentally dialed 8 instead of 9. As a result, she ended up leaving a dying message for Laura, whose number was programmed into that speed dial. Laura played a crucial role in the investigation, as she knew Sarah well and provided detectives with detailed information about the circumstances of Sarah's life in the months leading up to the incident. She believed that the only person who could have harmed Sarah was Sarah's ex-husband, Lorenzo. Laura mentioned that Lorenzo was very jealous of their son, Will. He had also stopped taking his depression medication, and his mental health issues had recently worsened. As far as Laura knew, Lorenzo also possessed 2 weapons. Despite this, Sarah tried to maintain a warm relationship with him until the end and even convinced Lorenzo to sell all the weapons from their home. Ultimately, this led to a divorce. After the divorce, his behavior became completely erratic. Sarah felt the need to go to court to obtain a restraining order for her protection. For instance, on June 27th, when Sarah handed Lorenzo the divorce papers, he physically assaulted her, took their child, and left the house, threatening that she would never see the child again. Fearing for her child's safety, Sarah didn't pursue him. That same evening, Lorenzo returned and told Sarah that if she didn't want to lose their son, they needed to be intimate. He was using their child to manipulate her. When he returned home, he refused to leave. The next day, June 28th, the threats continued, and he persisted in trying to coerce her into intimate relations. It wasn't until Monday, June 29th, that Sarah managed to call the police when Lorenzo was away. When the police arrived, Lorenzo defended himself by claiming that it was his house, his wife, and his son, insisting that nothing illegal had occurred. However, even the officers noted that his behavior was inappropriate. They had to remove Sarah and the child from the home, placing them in a patrol car. On June 29th, Sarah filed a lawsuit seeking a restraining order against Lorenzo. This marked the beginning of their battle for custody and child support. Lorenzo moved out, allowing Sarah to return to the house with her 1-year-old son, Will. According to Lorenzo's lawyer, Sarah was responsible for the matter, alleging that she frequently cheated on him. In August, a temporary custody agreement was established, allowing Lorenzo to spend 2 days a week with his son, Will, while Sarah was to care for the child the rest of the time. However, these meetings were tense, as Sarah was often humiliated by Lorenzo. In addition, he continued to threaten and bully her, especially threatening to take the child abroad, such as to the Philippines. Even Lorenzo's lawyer acknowledged that these threats were unreasonable. Nevertheless, he pursued obtaining a passport for the child. Lorenzo did not succeed in his plans. His inappropriate behavior led the police to suspect him of murder, making him the main suspect in Sarah's case. The neighbors lived far from Sarah's home, so no one heard anything during the attack, and there were no witnesses. People did not notice anything unusual, and although there were many alarms, no one had CCTV cameras that could provide evidence. Detectives discovered that on November 13th, shortly before Sarah's death, she called her friend Laura. The divorce was nearing its conclusion, and Lorenzo had not gained any advantages in the process. Sarah was genuinely afraid that he might seek revenge for this setback. She asked Laura to protect her son if anything happened to her. She also admitted that she had hidden a frying pan under her bed, which shows the level of fear she lived in during the last months of her life. At the time of Sarah's death, there were only 3 weeks left until the trial's conclusion. It was revealed that her son, Will, was safe and living with the Lorenzo family, which did not align with Sarah's wishes. She strongly objected to Lorenzo and his relatives raising Will if she died. On November 16th, the police went to Lorenzo's family home to inform him of Sarah's death and to monitor his reaction. When he opened the door and heard the news, he fell to his knees and sobbed. However, the police noticed that when he stood up, his face was not wet with tears. He was clearly trying to deceive them. Lorenzo was taken to the police station for questioning. He remained calm but displayed a sense of arrogance, consistently denying any involvement in the murder. Lorenzo told detectives that he picked up Will on Friday and spent all day Saturday with the child. He claimed that during the evening of the attack, he was at home with his family. However, since the witnesses were his relatives, his testimony was considered unreliable. Lorenzo also said that Sarah's killer could have been Don Luis, her former boss, with whom he claimed she had an affair. Lorenzo suspected that Don might want to kill Sarah to cover up the affair, as this could threaten his high position. However, the case clearly shows the perpetrator's hatred for Sarah and his personal motives. Therefore, detectives still considered Lorenzo the prime suspect. However, at that time, there was not enough evidence to charge him, so after interrogation, he was released. A warrant was then issued to collect DNA samples and search the Lorenzo family home. However, the process was difficult and dragged on for months. Meanwhile, blood analysis from the crime scene continued. Detectives maintained communication with the Lorenzo family, but they quickly contradicted his statements. Some family members claimed he was with them that evening, while others insisted he worked until 10 p.m. A search of his home and car did not turn up any items related to the crime. They also did not find shoes with footprints similar to those found at the scene. Detectives decided to re-interview Lorenzo, but he had hired a lawyer and refused to cooperate with the investigation. He was intelligent and had 2 master's degrees, which complicated matters. Then, officers from the NSA came to the aid of the police and decided to conduct their own investigation into the death of Sarah, their employee, using advanced technology and top experts. By this time, most tests and checks had been completed. The forensic expert determined that Sarah died from a deep neck wound that caused her to lose 80% of her blood. She suffered multiple deep wounds and significant blood loss from cuts on her wrists. Her lungs and liver were punctured, and she also sustained a serious brain injury that had initially been overlooked. The most severe injury was a nearly fatal blow to her neck. Meanwhile, NSA agents reviewed the recordings that Sarah had sent to Laura. They discovered that she had mentioned the name of her killer, Mike, as Lorenzo's brother. So, they decided to interview Mike, but he appeared very nervous and did not provide any useful information. Later, Mike's ex-wife Becky agreed to assist the police by using wiretaps. She called Mike, and they spoke for an extended period, attempting to extract information through leading questions, but to no avail. Eventually, the NSA completed its investigation and concluded that Sarah's murder had a personal motive. A month later, the DNA analysis results from the traces found on the machete were received. The analysis revealed Sarah's blood, along with traces of a male, likely her killer. To the surprise of law enforcement, the male DNA did not match any samples collected from the suspects in the case. The Lorenzo family and Don Luis remained silent for a month, during which no useful information was obtained. Detectives even contacted the FBI, but no new leads emerged. However, the agents were able to disprove the theory that Sarah mentioned her killer's name in the recording. Instead, the sounds heard were her death rattles. A breakthrough finally occurred when the station received a significant phone call from a detective with the Baltimore County Police. He revealed that an 18-year-old named Ardale Tickles had confessed to the murder. Ardale was in jail for attacking his former boss at McDonald's. While awaiting trial, he told a cellmate that he had killed a woman, and the details matched Sarah's case. In exchange for a lighter sentence, the cellmate agreed to record Ardale's confession with a hidden microphone. Ardale provided a detailed account of the murder that took place on November 13th. He admitted he didn't even know the victim's name. He broke into her house through a window, used foul language, and attacked her for an extended period. After the assault, he stood on her head and tried to crush it but was unsuccessful. He confessed that a former colleague had encouraged him to commit the crime for $5,000. Despite doubts about the reliability of his testimony, he provided important unpublished details about the attack, suggesting he was indeed involved in the murder. Ardale had already confessed, and the police wanted to hear his account directly to identify the person who had hired him. Ardale mentioned that a woman had approached him and labeled Sarah as a bad person. Ardale was black, while Sarah was said to have been racist. Furthermore, he felt hatred towards her because she was accused of being involved in the miscarriage of his best friend. He then decided to kill her. He told the police that he did not know the motives of the person who hired him to kill Sarah, and that he had been manipulated into carrying out the murder. Although he was expected to receive $5,000 for the job, he actually received only $3,000. However, he did not consider this a serious matter. He viewed the murder as a matter of honor. Ardale was shown photos of the main suspects in the case but did not recognize anyone. It was strange that he didn't even know the name of the person who had hired him. Ardale had a troubled childhood. His mother had schizophrenia, and he spent a significant amount of time in a boarding school where he was seriously injured in a fight with other students. This experience left a lasting impact on his life. Although he had no prior criminal record, he was very aggressive and easily influenced. When the police showed Ardale a photo of Lorenzo's mother, Amelia, he recognized her as the one who had hired him. He was shocked to realize how cruelly he had been deceived. Sarah was not a racist. She was simply interfering in the family of her ex-husband Lorenzo. Words alone are not enough to constitute solid evidence and bring charges. However, it was clear that Ardale and Amelia were in cahoots. DNA evidence from the machete handle confirmed Ardale's involvement, and Amelia's guilt was established through her financial transactions when she paid for the murder. Consequently, Amelia was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. One of Lorenzo's sisters revealed the nature of the relationship between Amelia and Sarah. Amelia had interfered too much in her son Lorenzo's marriage to Sarah. She was upset that Sarah did not listen to her. As Sarah and Lorenzo's relationship deteriorated, Amelia developed intense hatred towards Sarah. In her conversation with the police, Amelia acknowledged having conflicts with Sarah. She felt that Sarah's actions were a personal affront, largely due to the culture in the Philippines, where she grew up. There, children are expected to obey their mothers unconditionally. Amelia pointed out this cultural difference and considered Sarah's disobedient and disrespectful behavior towards her to be equivalent to a serious crime. Therefore, she believed that attacking Sarah was completely justified and felt no remorse for her actions. In January 2000, it was unusual that no members of Amelia's family were present in the courtroom, except for Amelia herself. She received no support from her family. Prosecutors argued that the motive for the attack was fear of losing custody of her nephew, Will. To carry out the murder, Amelia convinced Ardale to do it for her. She even expressed frustration that he was unable to kill Sarah as planned. After the hearings, Amelia was convicted of first-degree murder, but the charge of conspiracy to commit murder could not be established. At this point, Amelia changed her testimony, claiming that she only intended to scare Sarah into giving up custody of Will, not kill Sarah. Amelia stated that she showed Sarah's house to Ardale, along with some stones. However, the detectives did not believe her. Ardale knew the layout of the house and could get there without setting off the alarm. This clearly indicated that she had provided him with information, suggesting that their intention was more than just intimidation. Furthermore, no one would pay $3,000 just to have rocks thrown at a house. The verdict was announced on April 18, 2000. Amelia cried in court, claiming that she never meant for this to happen, but no one believed her. Amelia Domingo Raras was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Amelia stated that her son, Lorenzo, was not involved in her plan and was unaware of it. Their prison phone calls were recorded, and no evidence proved his guilt. Nevertheless, Sarah's family believes that Lorenzo persuaded his mother to commit the crime. Later, Lorenzo reached a plea deal with the prosecution, admitted his guilt, and expressed remorse, stating that he prays daily for Sarah and her family. Lorenzo Raras was sentenced to life in prison after confessing, but he became eligible for parole in February 2009. In February 2009, Amelia appealed her sentence, asking for a review because she claimed she had changed, becoming kinder and more religious. But her request was rejected. On February 8, 2023, Lorenzo passed away on his birthday at the age of 57. Amelia, now 88 years old, remains in prison. In 2024, Ardale became eligible for parole and submitted a petition, asserting that he has changed and wishes to turn his life around. A decision regarding his parole is still pending. Jessica Dishon was born on May 2, 1982, in the small American town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky. It was a quiet place where a lot of residents were involved in farming and knew each other well. Jessica had 2 younger brothers, and from an early age, she helped her parents to take care of the kids while they were working. This made Jessica more independent, and her parents could always rely on her. When she was 15, she took a part-time job at a local restaurant to save up for her first car she dreamed of, a red Pontiac. And a few years later, she had saved enough money to make that dream a reality. Despite her part-time job, Jessica had excellent grades and started to make plans to attend college to become an accountant after school. In the fall of 1999, when she was 17, Jessica entered her senior year. She also started dating a boy and was thrilled about it. On the morning of Friday, September 10th, her day began as usual. Jessica's parents left for work while she was still asleep. Her younger brothers went to the bus stop and left for school. Jessica stayed home and was supposed to drive to school in her car soon after her brothers. Somewhere around noon, her mother returned home and immediately noticed something weird. Jessica's car was parked in front of the house, although she should have been in class at that time. The mother entered the house and went to her daughter's room. Her initial thought was that Jessica might have overslept and missed school, but she wasn't in her bedroom. Next, the mother thought that, for some reason, Jessica might have asked her father for a ride to school. She called him, but he said he had gone to work alone that morning. Thinking there might be something wrong with Jessica's car, the mother took a spare key from the house to try starting it. However, as soon as she approached the car, she saw a disturbing scene. Firstly, the driver's door was slightly open. Secondly, and more alarming, Jessica's cell phone lay on the seat with the numbers 9 and 1 on the screen. Beneath the front seat lay one of Jessica's shoes and her keys, and in the back seat were her textbooks, work clothes, and purse. The mother immediately feared the worst. It was evident that someone had tried to dial 911 on Jessica's phone but didn't finish it. Moreover, Jessica obviously couldn't have just left all her belongings in the car and walked away. The family lived on the outskirts of town, so she would have had to cover several miles along the road on foot. Jessica's parents called the school, only to hear that their daughter hadn't attended class. Somehow, the school had failed to notify them about this, as it should have done. A few hours later, Jessica's best friend from the restaurant where they both worked called her parents, saying that Jessica hadn't shown up for her shift, increasing their concern. Concerned about Jessica's absence from school and work and the fact that her belongings, including a phone with 911 dialed, were left in an unlocked car, her parents decided to call the police. However, the sheriff simply suggested that Jessica likely wandered off and would return home eventually. He didn't even pay any attention to the fact that one of her shoes was left in the car, making it difficult for her to go far without it. Jessica's parents tried to convince the sheriff that their daughter might be in danger, but despite their pleas, he refused to open an investigation, leaving them with no choice but to return home. After that, Jessica's parents decided to take matters into their own hands. They contacted relatives, friends, and acquaintances, but no one had seen her. Together, they started to search for Jessica throughout the town, but she was nowhere to be seen. The next morning, her parents went back to the sheriff and told him that Jessica still didn't make it home. This time, he dispatched 2 officers to inspect her car. But their parents faced yet another problem. The officers examined the vehicle without gloves, touching everything inside with their bare hands. They also didn't check Jessica's room, although it was standard procedure. Once again let down by law enforcement, Jessica's parents tried to get some help from the local media, drawing their attention to their daughter's disappearance and the police's lack of interest. Alongside relatives and friends, they initiated their own search and also began distributing flyers with information about Jessica. The search was led by Jessica's father and his brother, Stanley, who knew the area well. Fearing the worst, they decided to search the vicinity near a local river. The area had a pretty bad reputation as it was popular among local drug dealers and other criminals due to its overgrown and secluded nature. For hours, Jessica's relatives combed through the difficult terrain near the river but found no trace of her. The next morning, something extremely weird happened. Jessica's parents were at home, and their son was playing in the yard. Suddenly, he rushed inside, claiming he heard a cry for help that sounded like his sister's voice. Jessica's father grabbed his shotgun and rushed outside, trying to locate the source of the cry. At the same time, his brother drove up to their house and quickly joined the search. Soon, they noticed something. There was a smoke rising from their neighbor's property, a 40-year-old man named David Brooks. As they approached, they saw him burning something that resembled clothing on his land. It looked highly suspicious, so Jessica's father asked Brooks for permission to search his farm. Brooks, however, refused and asked them to leave. This wasn't the only weird thing about Brooks. Before Jessica's disappearance, her relatives had maintained a normal relationship with him and his family. However, shortly after that, Brooks began behaving strangely. He started regularly driving slowly past their home, staring at them with an ominous smile. Jessica's parents also received mysterious phone calls where an unknown man remained silent and just breathed heavily. They suspected Brooks was behind it, but couldn't understand the reason for such behavior. After witnessing Brooks burning clothing on his property, Jessica's parents decided to once again speak to the police who had shown little interest in the case from the beginning. They shared their observations, asking officers to visit Brooks with cadaver dogs, and they agreed. Using Jessica's clothes to track her, the dogs led them to the fire pit on Brooks' property, but no substantial evidence was found. The dogs also discovered black gloves in one of the sheds, signaling the presence of a smell associated with decomposition. Throughout the search, Brooks displayed increasingly suspicious behavior, yet the police failed to connect him to Jessica's disappearance, once again leaving empty-handed. Disappointed by the police, Jessica's father decided to reach out to the FBI. The Bureau usually refrains from initiating investigations based solely on calls from the relatives of missing persons. But this time, they decided to get involved immediately in light of the disturbing facts presented by Jessica's parents. And after a thorough research, the FBI concluded that something truly horrific might have happened to her. From this point on, a real investigation began, one that local cops had been reluctant to conduct. FBI agents collected fingerprints from Jessica's room and her car. They also seized all potential evidence for analysis and sent it all to the lab. Investigators also organized extensive search on the ground using helicopters and gathering volunteers. They thoroughly examined the bottom of the pond near Jessica's home, considering the possibility that her body might be there. FBI agents meticulously combed through Brooks's farm, and there they found something very alarming. In one of the sheds, they found a printed photo of Jessica. After this disturbing discovery, detectives were almost certain that Brooks was somehow involved in her disappearance. They also suspected his 35-year-old brother, Joseph, as he behaved strangely while the police were searching his property. However, there was a problem. During the search, investigators found no evidence substantial enough to arrest the brothers, so they focused all their efforts on the search in the area, almost certain that Jessica was no longer alive. On September 27th, 17 days after her disappearance, the police received a call. A woman was driving along the road near the river where Jessica's father had searched for her in the initial days. She saw something strange near a tree just off the road and decided to inspect it. The woman came closer, realized it resembled a human body, and called the police right away. The FBI agents arrived at the scene and indeed found the lifeless body of a young woman missing some fingers and limbs. She had a rope with tracks of red and silver paint tied around her legs. Parts of her clothing were missing, leading detectives to believe that the perpetrator sexually abused her. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, they couldn't confirm if it was Jessica. The officers went to her house and asked her parents to help identify her. Jessica's father couldn't bring himself to look at his deceased daughter, but her mother agreed. She arrived at the scene and at first couldn't identify her, but soon she noticed a small butterfly tattoo on the body, identical to her daughter's and located on the same spot. Later, medical experts confirmed the identity of the deceased and determined that her cause of death was strangulation. Numerous bruises were also found on her body. Experts revealed that her limbs and fingers were detached post-mortem, meaning she was still alive at the time. But even that wasn't the most devastating fact. It turned out that Jessica had been alive for approximately 3 days after her disappearance. It meant that the police had a chance to save her, yet they took no action whatsoever to do that. After the discovery of the body, the FBI decided to re-interview Brooks, and this time they found out something new. During their initial conversation, he claimed to have seen Jessica near her house on the morning she vanished. However, this time he changed his story, stating that he hadn't seen her at all that day. Now he claimed he was at home in bed with his wife that morning. And when detectives questioned his wife, she contradicted her husband's testimony. The FBI continued to question Brooks, asking him what he would do if they found his fingerprints on the victim's body. Although there was no such evidence found, Brooks' response was extremely suspicious. He said he would have to confess to everything in that case. Later, he failed a polygraph test, so the FBI decided to arrest him and move forward with the trial. They were aware that the chances of a guilty verdict were relatively low as they hadn't found any solid evidence linking Brooks to the murder. All they had were disturbing but indirect indications of his involvement. The detectives continued working on the case, searching for any additional evidence as the trial preparations unfolded. Investigators recalled another interesting detail. During the search of Brooks' car, they found a rope similar to the one used to tie the victim's legs. However, no DNA samples were found on it, making it another piece of circumstantial evidence. The trial began in January 2003. Brooks' lawyer insisted on the complete absence of evidence and declared his client's innocence. Something else came to light during the trial. When the body was discovered, investigators also found some missing limbs of the victim nearby. They placed them in special containers and handed them over to the local police. Ignoring labels that said "store it in the refrigerator," They left the boxes at room temperature, causing extensive decomposition. So even if there was some potential evidence, including possible DNA traces from the killer, it was lost due to this error. All other circumstantial pieces of evidence against Brooks lacked sufficient weight. Ultimately, the jurors couldn't reach a unanimous decision, so the man walked free. According to state laws, he could only be charged again if new evidence was found. For Jessica's parents, this was a devastating blow. They had almost no doubt that Brooks was behind their daughter's murder. Moreover, had the police taken their job more seriously, their daughter might have been saved. So, in the end, they lost all hope of achieving justice. In the following years, this case remained unsolved, and eventually it was almost entirely abandoned. In 2012, a new detective, Lynn Hunt, joined the local police department. She was assigned to investigate unsolved cases, and her initial focus fell on the murder of Jessica Dishon. Upon reviewing the case files, she was shocked by the negligence of her predecessors. Most of the documents were filled with errors, missing any reference to conversations with the involved parties, and the evidence wasn't properly documented. In other words, it was so ineffectively handled that she had to essentially start the investigation from scratch 13 years after the murder. Her first step was to speak with Jessica's family. One of her brothers, now an adult living separately from his parents, handed her a box of Jessica's belongings from her car. He had kept it since the police returned these items to the family. Once again, Hunt was astonished at how carelessly her colleagues had handled the evidence, failing to store it properly according to protocol. Now, after so many years, these items were unlikely to help her, yet she diligently continued to examine everything she could find. Soon, she discovered an interesting detail among the documents. It was Brooks's medical examination report. It stated that his IQ was only 61, which is quite low. This raised concerns about all police actions, including Brooks's interrogations. Given his significantly low IQ, he might have not fully understood most of the questions and could have given less than adequate answers. All of this led Hunt to consider that the man might have no connection to the case at all, as his weird behavior could easily be explained by his extremely low IQ. Then Hunt began to think who else could have committed this murder. She extensively researched everyone involved in the case or living nearby. This went on until September 2014, nearly 15 years after Jessica's death. A colleague from another department called Hunt to share intriguing information. An inmate from a Kentucky state prison claimed to know the real identity of Jessica Dishon's murderer. Hunt approached this lead with slight skepticism. Usually, when inmates wanted to share some information with the police, it ended in disappointment and wasted time. Many of them just imagined some stories to secure early release or improve their conditions in prison. Still, she understood that she couldn't ignore this lead without verification. She went to the prison and met with the man who supposedly had the information. According to him, he shared a cell for some time with an individual convicted of child abuse, the same charge as his. On this common ground, the two became friends and exchanged details about their crimes occasionally. One day, the cellmate told him that, among other things, he had murdered Jessica Dishon. After that, the informant dropped a bombshell, giving the detective the name of this man, leaving her in shock. It was Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, her father's brother. According to the informant, Stanley told him that he had sexually abused Jessica for several years while living in their home. He threatened to kill her or someone close to her if she ever talked about it. In the spring of '99, when Jessica got a boyfriend, Stanley began to fear that sooner or later she might confess to him about the abuse by her own uncle. On the morning of September 10th, Stanley arrived at her home when Jessica was alone. She was outside, getting into her car, having already loaded all her belongings. Stanley approached her and demanded that she break up with her boyfriend, but Jessica refused and threatened to expose him if he didn't leave her alone. He started threatening her, and she reached for the phone, attempting to dial 911. Tried to grab her, but Jessica broke free and ran into the house. The man followed her to her room, struck her, and bound her in her sheets before taking her to an abandoned shed not far from where her body would later be found. Stanley kept her alive there for several days, subjecting her to abuse and torture. Then he killed her, moved the body to a visible location near the road, and buried the sheets in the ground beneath the shed. He also mentioned that after the murder, he removed some of the victim's limbs, hoping to mislead the police into thinking drug traffickers were involved. Detective Hunt realized that this information was never disclosed. Only Jessica's closest relatives knew about the missing limbs, so the informant couldn't have fabricated this detail. At last, he also added that Stanley buried Jessica's shoe beneath a broken tree near the shed. Hunt decided to verify all this information about the buried evidence. Given the shortage of stuff in the local police department, no one from there could help her, so she reached out to Jessica's brother and a few other relatives who agreed to participate in the search. She didn't tell them that Stanley might be the murderer, as she decided to find some evidence to support these shocking accusations. First, on the first day of the search, they failed to uncover any clues. Under the pouring rain, they dug in the areas matching the informant's description, but it yielded no results. The next day, Jessica's brother and Hunt returned to the site. On the way, he pointed out an abandoned barn alongside the road. They headed there and started digging the soil inside, and almost immediately, there was a long-awaited breakthrough. They discovered a buried bedsheet. Hunt collected the evidence and hurried to Jessica's home. Throughout these years, her parent hadn't made any changes to her room. It remained exactly as it was on the day their daughter vanished. Thanks to this, Hunt was able to confirm that the found bedsheet was part of Jessica's bedding. It was absent from the bed, and the other linen shared the same pattern. Immediately after this discovery, Stanley was arrested and brought in for questioning. He refused to confess to the crime, although he appeared visibly shaken during the conversation with the detectives. Eventually, he was charged with murder, and the case proceeded to court. Jessica's father couldn't believe that his own brother had committed such a heinous act against his daughter. He went through a phase of complete denial, but eventually came to terms with this unbearable reality. Later, he recalled that in the early days of Jessica's disappearance, it was Stanley who suggested searching for the body near the river. However, during the search, he suddenly felt sick and his brother drove him home. It turned out this happened just a few hundred yards from the barn where Jessica was located, suggesting that Stanley deliberately diverted them from finding her while she was still alive. During the preparation for the trial, Detective Hunt researched the suspect's past, trying to find some additional evidence. She already knew he had served time for assaulting another girl in their family, but Hunt soon discovered an even more disturbing fact. Several other women closely related to Stanley told the police that he had sexually abused them at a young age. The pattern was consistent. He would tell his relatives that he temporarily had nowhere to live and ask them to let him stay in their home for a while. When left alone with the girls, Stanley committed his vile deeds, using threats to silence them. Hearing all of these stories, the police concluded that Stanley had been doing this for 3 decades. Despite all of this, Detective Hunt realized that securing a conviction for the murder would be challenging since there were almost no straight pieces of evidence against Stanley, such as fingerprints or DNA. She continued to dig into the case until she stumbled upon a box of old files she hadn't examined yet. Looking through its contents, Hunt was once again shocked by the incompetence of her predecessors who initially handled the case. In the box, there was a letter dated June 26, 2002. Another informant wrote to the police the same story that Hunt heard only 12 years later from the Kentucky prison inmate. By the February, Stanley was already serving time for assaulting an underage relative. During that time, he told his cellmate about murdering Jessica. The cellmate, who happened to be a police informant, wrote a letter to the department handling the case disclosing all the gruesome details of what Stanley had done to his niece. And what do you think the police did? They simply ignored the letter, likely convinced of Brooks' involvement in those years, so they didn't bother considering other suspects. Once again, Hunt was disappointed by her colleagues' lack of professionalism. If only they had paid more attention to their job, this case could have been solved back in February 2002. By now, after all these years, she could only await the trial, hoping that Stanley would finally face delayed justice for his actions. The process began in February 2015, and Stanley declared his innocence. Present in the courtroom, Jessica's parents could hardly look at their relative who had destroyed their lives. They were also furious that he couldn't just confess to give them some sort of closure. The prosecution believed that the chances of obtaining a guilty verdict on murder charges were relatively low, mainly because there was almost no substantial evidence against him. There was also a problem with the assault charges involving other girls in the family. All of them would have to testify in court describing Stanley's actions against them in great detail. So, the prosecution decided to offer Stanley a plea deal. They agreed to drop the death penalty in exchange for Stanley's confession, both in assaults on relatives and Jessica's murder. In the end, he agreed and pleaded guilty. As part of the deal, he wasn't required to disclose any specific details of the crimes. Jessica's parents, who desired to know the whole truth, weren't happy about it, but Stanley remained silent. Under the plea deal terms, the murderer received a 20-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Given that he was 56 at the time of sentencing, Stanley might be released at 71. After the trial, Jessica's father promised that if his brother doesn't die in prison, he'll be waiting for him to take matters into his own hands. In February 2019, Stanley gave his first interview claiming he didn't kill Jessica. According to him, he was at work that morning, but it was impossible to verify after 2 decades. He also couldn't explain how 2 unrelated informants came up with identical stories, including details only known to the murderer, such as a bedsheet's burial site. As for David Brooks, detectives still don't rule out his potential minor involvement in the case. Stanley knew him and could have asked for help in disposing of the victim's belongings. Given Brooks' low IQ, he might have not fully understood the whole situation. It's possible that he burned the girl's clothes in the fire, and Stanley might have handed him the gloves with the scent of the body that the dogs detected. It's also possible that he left Jessica's photo in Stanley's shed to frame him. However, the truth may never be revealed as Brooks passed away in 2021 due to heart problems. It's worth mentioning the moment when, on the 3rd day of Jessica's disappearance, her younger brother heard a cry for help outside, thinking it was his sister. It's still impossible to say with certainty what happened. At that time, the girl could have still been alive, but Stanley was holding her in the barn a few miles away from her home. Most likely, the child either imagined it due to stress or someone else was screaming, but there's a somewhat unlikely version. As we recall, right after Jessica's father rushed outside, Stanley drove up to the house, which means he was nearby. Could be that the girl was in his car with her mouth taped shut or unconscious. However, this theory seems highly improbable. The case of Diane Hollik. Diane Hollik, a 43-year-old senior executive at IBM, was known for her reliability. So when she missed a scheduled work call on the morning of November 16, 2001, her colleagues were immediately concerned. Unable to reach her, they alerted the police, asking them to check on her at home. The officers' discovery at her house was gruesome. Born in 1958 in New York City, Diane was a driven person who had built a successful career at IBM, one of the world's largest hardware and software companies. Over 20, her hard work had earned her a senior position, allowing her to work from her home office in Austin, Texas, where she had moved in 1996. Diane lived a luxurious life in the suburbs, hosting wine-tasting parties, frequenting expensive restaurants and dance clubs, and engaging in charity work. She was also trying to improve her personal life. In mid-November 2001, a severe storm warning was in effect in Texas, bringing torrential rains and tornadoes to Austin. On the morning of November 16th, Diane worked from home, but her company had scheduled a work call. Despite having multiple phones, including her home phone, she stopped answering all of them. Her colleagues left messages asking her to call back, and they soon became concerned when she didn't respond. They contacted the police department and requested that someone be sent to Diane's house to check on her welfare. When the officers arrived, Diane's neighbor, who had a spare key, noticed their presence. The police entered the house, where they were met with complete silence, broken only by the sound of dogs emerging from the kitchen. As they received no response from Diane, they began to search the house. In the second-floor bedroom, they made the grim discovery of Diane Hollik's lifeless body. Diane's home was one of the cleanest crime scenes detectives had ever encountered. Her body, fully dressed, lay in the bedroom next to her bed. Strangulation marks on her neck, resembling those left by a rope, and signs of wrist binding with cable ties indicated a crime had taken place. The lack of theft, struggle, or forced entry led detectives to suspect that Diane's killer was someone she knew and trusted. There was no evidence of forced intimacy before her death, but dark spots and red stains on the carpet near the bedroom entrance suggested a possible struggle. One anomaly in the otherwise tidy home caught the detectives' attention. A towel lying on the back of the living room sofa seemed out of place. They sent it to the laboratory for analysis, hoping it might provide a crucial clue. The police spoke to the people who knew Diane and found that she didn't have any known enemies, although it's possible that some might have been unknown. During their investigation, they discovered that Diane was in a romantic relationship with Dennis Conley, the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. This wasn't her first marriage. Her previous one had ended quickly. Diane and Dennis met through a dating service, and he had 2 children from a previous marriage. Dennis was a businessman living in Houston, around 50 miles from Austin, where Diane resided. Despite the distance and infrequent meetings, they grew close quickly. And after 2 months of communicating, Dennis proposed to Diane, giving her a $17,500 platinum ring. She accepted his proposal. According to Diane's close friends, her relationship with Dennis had begun to deteriorate recently. As an independent woman focused on building her career, Diane felt uneasy with Dennis's occasional attempts to control her. Another issue was the decision to move to Houston. The couple had decided to start their life together in his hometown, so Diane put her suburban Austin home up for sale. However, realtors struggled to find a buyer willing to pay the $435,000 asking price for the property. Detectives investigated whether Dennis was involved in Diane's death, asking him to come to the police station for a voluntary conversation without an attorney. Dennis agreed and spoke candidly with the detectives. The medical examiner's report indicated that Diane died between 3 p.m. on November 15th and 3 a.m. on November 16th. A strange detail caught their attention. Diane's wedding ring, given to her by Dennis, was missing from her finger, while her other jewelry in the bedroom remained untouched. This led to the theory that the killer had a personal motive or deliberately removed the ring to mislead the investigation. Dennis presented himself as a grieving person. The detectives asked him about his relationship with Diane and his whereabouts on the day of her death and the day her body was found. According to Dennis, he was in Houston at the time, claiming he last spoke with Diane on the morning of November 15th. He spent the entire day at work without contacting her again the following morning. When he couldn't reach her, he left a voicemail unaware of her death. Dennis acknowledged that their relationship was troubled, revealing recent arguments before concluding the conversation. The police collected his fingerprints and a DNA sample, but it was possible he could have traveled to Austin, interacted with Diane, and returned to Houston by the next morning. However, after verifying his alibi, the detectives determined he had not left the city, so they had to pursue another suspect. Before leaving the police station, Dennis provided a crucial lead that changed the direction of the investigation, pointing out that Rye, one of Diane's co-workers, had shown an unusual interest in her. The detectives looked into this and found that Rye frequently visited Diane's home and sometimes walked her dogs, but he had a solid alibi ruling him out as a suspect. When speaking with Diane's colleagues, the authorities discovered that a mysterious individual had inspected her house a few days before her death. He claimed he would make a cash offer if he liked the property and planned to return with his wife in a few days to make a joint decision on the purchase. As this was one of the few leads the police had, they concentrated all their efforts on finding this unknown buyer. Hoping someone might have seen him when he visited Diane's house, the detectives decided to investigate the owners of properties for sale in the area where Diane lived, suspecting that the mysterious buyer might have viewed more than just the victim's house. They conducted interviews with the owners and discovered that 7 women had experienced a similar incident. A 35 to 45-year-old man with a prominent nose and dark hair, styled back, had visited their homes on the day of Diane's death without a real estate agent present. While 6 women had refused him entry, 1 woman had allowed him inside. According to her, the man's behavior became strange after entering the house. He didn't show any interest in the rooms or doors, and only asked her to show him the second-floor bedroom. She sensed something was off and asked him to leave. Notably, he had introduced himself as Walter Miller when requesting permission to view the property. The police searched their databases for the name Walter Miller in Austin, but found 2 individuals with that name, neither of whom matched the age or physical description of the suspect. As detectives probed the motive behind the crime, they wondered why the thief had only taken the wedding ring, and whether they might have stolen other jewelry or cash, given the victim's wealth and history of living alone, which made it impossible to determine the extent of her jewelry collection. They also questioned the significance of the perpetrator, removing the cable ties that bound Diane's hands and taking them with him. Did he know her personally? The autopsy revealed no signs of sexual assault prior to Diane's death, and her body was found fully clothed. Despite this, the detectives returned to her home to search for any traces of semen, assuming the perpetrator might have left behind some evidence. However, their search yielded nothing. A composite sketch of a potential suspect was broadcast on evening news programs, urging anyone with information about a similar individual to come forward. One of the few leads available to investigators was a few strands of hair found on a towel at Diane's residence. Although the hair lacked roots, preventing a complete DNA analysis, detectives remained hopeful that a partial DNA profile could still yield results. A woman contacted the police after seeing the composite sketch, which she believed resembled a suspect in the Diane Hollik case. During her interview with detectives, she recounted how she and her husband had listed their house for sale 6 months prior. A man had arrived claiming he wanted to purchase the property with cash, but needed to view it first. Since no real estate agent was present, she refused to let the stranger inside. 2 months later, the same man reappeared on her doorstep, introducing himself as Jim Taylor. With her husband away at work and only her young daughter present, the man again asked to enter the house. When she denied his request, he became agitated, shouting and insisting that he be allowed inside. The woman threatened to call the police, prompting the would-be buyer to leave. Still shaken, she wrote down the man's name and the license plate number of his minivan, which had been parked in her driveway. When she saw the suspect's portrait on the news, she immediately recognized him as the same person who had come to her house a while back. This new information led the police to obtain the license plate number, which they then used to identify the vehicle's owner through their database. However, the owner's name was not Jim Taylor, as they had initially suspected, but rather Patrick Anthony Russo. At first, it seemed unlikely that Russo was involved in Diane's death. He appeared to be a family man, living 40 minutes from Austin with his wife and 2 children, and even played in a local church music band. But as the police dug deeper into his past, they discovered a more sinister history. Russo was an ex-convict who had served time for a series of attacks on women. One of these attacks had even escalated to abduction, where he had tied his victim up with cable ties and attempted to strangle her, stopping only at the last moment. For this crime, he had been sentenced to 20 years in prison. While serving his sentence, Anthony Russo met his future wife Janet, a volunteer at the prison's church program. Despite his lengthy criminal record, Russo was granted parole after serving 8 years of his 20-year sentence. The police was skeptical about the coincidence, so they obtained a search warrant for Anthony Russo's residence. When the police arrived, Anthony answered the door, but they found no incriminating evidence inside his house, including Diane's ring or any other personal belongings. A subsequent search of his minivan also yielded nothing. However, the neighbors reported seeing a similar vehicle parked outside Diane's house on the day of her murder. Significantly, the police discovered several cable ties in the utility room that matched the ones that left marks on Diane's wrists. Although we might consider the tie as evidence, it's still indirect because anyone can purchase it at a hardware store. The investigator informed Anthony that his name had come up during an investigation and asked him to come to the station for a more in-depth conversation. At the station, the investigators asked Russo about his whereabouts on November Russo explained that on Thursday, the 15th, he traveled to Austin to visit a religious radio station, but was unable to enter because no one answered the door. Coincidentally, this radio station is located near Diane Hall's house. According to Russo, he headed home around 4 p.m., but got slightly lost due to a hurricane, which delayed his arrival until around 6 p.m. When the police questioned Russo about his intentions to purchase a house, he claimed he had never browsed any properties for sale. This response proved to be pivotal as it would later have significant repercussions. Upon being shown a photograph of Diane, Russo remained expressionless and denied ever having met her. Although the police were unable to find any evidence linking Russo to the crime, they were forced to release him. However, the following day, detectives visited the radio station Russo had mentioned and uncovered evidence that his previous statement about the closed doors was a fabrication. The employees at the station revealed that they had not closed the doors as a large crowd had gathered in the lobby due to an approaching tornado. Meanwhile, a second woman approached the police after encountering a man who resembled the suspect's sketch while trying to sell her house. When the stranger came to her door with a pamphlet featuring local house listings, including her own, she let him in to view the property under the pretense that he would make a cash offer. However, when she showed him a bedroom, he attempted to attack her, but retreated hastily upon hearing her child cry in the adjacent room. The quick-thinking woman retained the pamphlet, which held a crucial fingerprint that the police later matched to Anthony Russo. Russo's claim of never having looked at houses for sale was thus discredited, and his false statement constituted a misdemeanor, a probation violation. Russo's arrest was prompted by his failure to meet parole conditions. Fearing he might flee while they gathered evidence linking him to Diane's death, authorities deemed it necessary to detain him. The police tracked down 15 women who had shown Russo around their homes. All of these women were later brought in to identify the suspect. In a lineup, the women saw 5 men, including Anthony Russo, all dressed similarly and with similar appearances. Each of these men repeated the phrase, "You have a beautiful house," in turn. 10 of the 15 women identified Anthony Russo as the man who had viewed their homes prior to purchasing. The other 5 women were unable to make a positive identification. When the police questioned Russo again, he knew he had been caught lying. Despite this, he continued to proclaim his innocence. At one point, he requested to see his wife and then refused to answer any more questions. The detective soon received a report from the laboratory, which confirmed that the mitochondrial sequence of the hair found on the towel at Diane's house matched Anthony Russo's DNA. While this was a significant finding, it was not conclusive as there was a small chance, 1 in 12,900,000 according to court documents, that the hair could have belonged to someone else. Although the investigation had accumulated a significant amount of circumstantial evidence, there was no single piece of direct evidence linking Russo to Diane Hollik's death. One additional piece of circumstantial evidence, however, was the report on the location of his cell phone, which placed Russo in the same area where Diane lived on the day she died. After examining the computer seized from his house, experts found a disturbing search history. Russo, a 37-year-old father of 2 and regular churchgoer, frequently visited an adult website. On this site, he watched videos and read articles about strangulation during intimate interactions. Notably, access to these materials required payment. Even more alarming was the discovery that just days before Diane's death, Russo read a story about a man who posed as a buyer to enter a lonely woman's home, strangled her, and then stole valuables, making it seem like a robbery to conceal his true motive of satisfying a desire for strangulation. The detectives conducted a thorough investigation into Russo and his wife's financial situation. Despite having only $2,000 in savings, Russo claimed to be in the market for a new home, which raised suspicions. Furthermore, the couple had yet to pay off the mortgage on their current residence, although there was no concrete evidence to prove this. On February 5, 2004, more than 2 years after Diane Hollik's death, the police arrested Anthony Russo on suspicion of her murder. During his trial, 14 women took the stand testifying under oath that Russo had approached them about purchasing a house. Several of these women reported that Russo had visited them on the day of Diane's death, although they refused to let him into their homes. One woman, however, initially allowed him in before asking him to leave due to his unusual behavior. Notably, All the women Russo targeted were of a similar age, suggesting that he had been observing them before making his move. Russo appeared to have a specific type of woman in mind. The prosecution presented the evidence again, describing the events of that fateful November day. As previously stated, Diane informed a colleague that a potential buyer had visited to view the house. Prosecutors suggested that Russo learned Diane lived alone when he first saw the house on November 15th. He toured homes for sale, but only one woman, Diane, let him inside. On his return to Diane's house, Russo likely asked to view the property again, but this time with a sinister motive, carefully planning his actions to avoid leaving evidence. On the rainy day, Diane unexpectedly offered him a towel to dry his hands and face, which he carelessly discarded on the back of the sofa. As she showed him the house again, Russo attacked her on the second floor. Prosecutors believed Russo derived pleasure from strangling, ultimately causing Diane's death during their second encounter. Before leaving, Russo stole cable ties and Diane's wedding ring, which the police were unable to find. He locked the door using a spare key kept at the front door. Russo's former and current wives testified in court, and both claimed that Anthony Russo took pleasure in the act of strangulation. It's notable that this was not his first offense, as he had a prior conviction for a similar crime. After deliberating for 11 hours, the jury found Patrick Anthony Russo guilty, and the court sentenced him to life in prison. Despite his history of criminal behavior, Russo never admitted to his guilt. He will become eligible for parole again and can file his first parole petition in 2044, at which point he will be over 80 years old. Kirsten Hatfield was born on February 12, 1989 in Midwest City, Oklahoma. The girl's father left the family right after her birth, leading their mother, Shannon, to move to her parents' house. They helped her raise the child, and when Kirsten turned 2, they moved to their own home. Later, Shannon got married again, and her second daughter, Faith, was born. This marriage also didn't last long, leaving the woman to raise her daughters alone. Despite her young age, Kirsten helped her mother take care of her younger sister. Thanks to this, she became very independent and got along pretty well with Faith. The girls shared a bedroom, while their mother slept in the next one. On the evening of May 13, 1997, when Kirsten was 8 years old and her sister 3, Shannon prepared the girls for sleep. Usually, she reads them a story, but this time, Faith had already fallen asleep and the woman didn't want to wake her. She wished her older daughter a good night and went to her bedroom, leaving the door to the girls' room slightly ajar. She did this every night in case either of the girls woke up and called her. Somewhere around 3 a.m., Shannon was awakened by a noise coming from her daughter's room. Thinking the girls had woken up, she went to their room. However, as soon as she reached the corridor and approached the door to their bedroom, the noise stopped. Assuming the girls had gone back to sleep, she decided not to wake them and was about to return to her room. But before she did, something strange caught her eye. The door to the girls' room was completely closed, although Shannon always left it slightly open. She thought one of the girls might have closed the door, or she herself had forgotten to leave it open. Shannon approached the door, opened it slightly, but didn't enter the room, then went back to sleep. The next morning, around 6:30 a.m., Shannon went to wake the girls. She entered their bedroom and found that only her younger daughter, Faith, was in bed. She woke her up and asked where Kirsten was, but Faith didn't know. The woman immediately began searching the entire house, but the girl was nowhere to be found. She looked outside, then called all of her friends whose children Kirsten was friends with. She hoped the girl had gone to one of them, but they all said they hadn't seen her. After that, Shannon called her father, who lived nearby. Her last hope was that the girl had gone to him, but he also hadn't seen her. Realizing that Kirsten had disappeared, he told Shannon to call the police and went to their house. So, the woman called 911 and officers arrived at the scene within a few minutes. Initially, they thought the girl might have been hiding somewhere in the house or had gone for a walk. In their quiet town, there had never been a case of a child being abducted from their own bedroom, so the local police had never encountered anything like it. However, soon the officers realized the situation was much more serious. Upon inspecting Kirsten's room, they found the window slightly ajar with a few drops of blood on the frame. The police went outside and began examining the area around the window. A few yards away, they discovered a piece of children's underwear on the ground stained with blood. The officers asked Shannon to confirm that it belonged to her daughter, and she recognized it. Investigators realized they were likely dealing with a kidnapping, and more officers were immediately called to the scene. When they searched the area behind and around the house, police questioned the girl's mother. She recounted waking up at 3 a.m. after hearing a noise. Suddenly, she realized that at that moment, an unknown criminal was likely abducting Kirsten. The search around the house yielded no results, and the police started interviewing all residents in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, none of them saw or heard anything suspicious that night. The only lead detectives could gather was that one of the neighbors was awakened by a dog barking around 3 a.m., coinciding with the time of the abduction. Failing to find any solid leads, investigators turned to a child psychologist to speak with Faith. Despite being only 3 years old, she shared that she had witnessed the abduction. However, she kept repeating only one phrase, "A bad person came and took my sister." This once again confirmed that the girl did not leave the house willingly, but it provided no further clues to identify the perpetrator or locate Kirsten. Detectives had to restart the investigation practically from scratch. Their initial suspicion leaned towards someone who knew Kirsten well, as it seemed unlikely that a stranger could abduct her from her own room without a sound. Working on this theory, police discovered that the girl's mother had a history of drug-related problems. The detectives considered the possibility that the abduction might be related to this. Perhaps the mother owed money to some people in the criminal underworld and they decided to take her daughter as payment. The alternative was even more chilling. The police did not rule out the mother willingly handing over her daughter. This would explain why the abduction happened almost silently. They spoke with Shannon, but she denied any involvement. She claimed to have been clean from illegal substances for a long period of time and insisted she would never give away her daughter. Detectives didn't rush to clear her of suspicions, but they couldn't find any evidence to support the mother's involvement. So, the police decided to seek the public's help, reaching out through the media, asking people to share any information related to the case. In the following days, the police department received hundreds of calls, and detectives diligently followed up on each lead. Most of them were quite superficial and lacked any valuable information. However, investigators soon stumbled upon some disturbing tip. A woman called in, suspecting her boyfriend of being involved in a kidnapping. He had been behaving aggressively, even stating during an argument that if she didn't obey him, he would do to her what he did to Kirsten Hatfield. As the police began investigating this man, they uncovered another alarming fact. He was acquainted with Shannon's brother, meaning Kirsten might have known him. Moreover, the girls and their mother lived in a house that previously belonged to her brother, leading the investigators to believe that the suspect might have been familiar with the layout. The man also had a history that brought him into the police's view, including involvement with drugs and even assault. Everything pointed to him possibly being connected to the crime. However, the man claimed he was at a bar that night. Police verified this information and numerous witnesses confirmed his alibi, placing him at the bar until around 4 a.m., eliminating the possibility of him abducting the girl. Following this, investigators pursued hundreds of other leads, but all of them led to dead ends. The case stretched over months, and with each passing day, hope of finding Kirsten alive dwindled. Her mother couldn't just wait and do nothing as the police repeatedly hit dead ends. From the early days, she tried everything in her power to locate her daughter. She gave interviews to the local media, distributed flyers, and even personally investigated various suspects. In her quest for the truth, Shannon faced numerous challenges. For instance, she came up with the idea of reaching out to local businesses in the county, asking them to put flyers about Kirsten in their offices, stores, and establishments. To her surprise, many refused, citing it contradicted company policies. She also attempted to secure a meeting with the state governor, but it was unsuccessful. Shannon also organized a small center with the goal of attracting volunteers to Kirsten's case. They mainly focused on distributing flyers and engaging with the media, but Shannon encountered new problems. Some volunteers stole money, others lied about the work done, and used the media to draw attention to themselves. Despite all of this, she never gave up trying to unravel the truth for many years. At one point, Shannon realized that the current approach wasn't yielding any results, prompting her to take a different path. She enrolled in college, earned a degree in criminology, and became a parole officer. Shannon chose this path not only to find her daughter's kidnapper, but also to protect others from criminals who might be released from prison and still pose a threat. She strongly believed that the person who took Kirsten had other criminal convictions. In her detailed study of individuals with violent pasts in her town and surrounding areas, she attempted to find any connection to her daughter's abduction. However, in the end, all of these efforts yielded no results. At some point, Shannon resigned herself to the likelihood that Kirsten was probably no longer alive and she would never be able to bring her back. Nevertheless, she never abandoned her quest for answers completely. The police occasionally reopened the case, examining new leads, but it yielded no results. In collaboration with the FBI, they even created a sketch of what Kirsten might look like years after the abduction. No one believed she was still alive, yet without her remains, they couldn't declare this with absolute certainty. The stagnation in the case lasted for many years until an unexpected turn of events. In February 2014, a woman called the police with a rather bizarre story. Her grandmother had recently passed away, and as she sorted through the remaining belongings, she found a diary. In it, the grandmother detailed how her own son had confessed to killing Kirsten Hatfield. The narrative contained such a wealth of details that detectives had no doubt about the authenticity of the information. According to the diary, the man abducted Kirsten from her bedroom and took her to a nearby town where he owned a house. There, he subjected her to heinous acts and brutally murdered her. The description of the entire process spanned several pages, leaving even seasoned investigators horrified. Furthermore, the diary mentioned that the entire ordeal was recorded on videocassette. Detectives immediately brought in the woman's son for questioning. While they anticipated him denying everything, his words surprised them even more. He claimed no involvement in the crime but knew who committed it because the girl was killed in his ex-girlfriend's house. This perplexed the police, prompting them to ask the man for the address of this house. Detectives swiftly obtained a warrant and sent in a team to thoroughly examine the property. Their first step involved spraying luminol, a substance that emits a glow upon contact with even the tiniest traces of blood, even if it had been cleaned from the scene of the crime. When the forensic experts did this, they were met with genuine shock. One of them later stated that the entire house lit up like a Christmas tree. The chemical revealed that blood was practically everywhere, and most importantly, the blood-stained patterns matched the gruesome details of the murder described in the diary. Experts removed floorboards, cut out sections of wallpaper, and sent out everything to the lab. They also assembled a team for excavations on the property, hoping to find the girl's body. In addition, the police found a box in the house containing hundreds of video cassettes, prompting them to recall the diary. They knew that one of these tapes should contain footage of the victim being abused. Detectives meticulously reviewed each tape, a process that took countless hours. However, none of the cassettes contained anything relating to the murder. The excavations also yielded no results. There were no remains or any evidence in the soil on the property. But then, the detectives faced the most unexpected twist. Experts analyzing the remains of the bloodstains in the house concluded that the blood belonged to an animal, not a human. This came as an absolute shock to the police as they were convinced they were finally on the verge of solving Kirsten's case. Instead, investigators faced yet another false lead. What this was exactly remains unknown. Perhaps someone decided to play a cruel joke on the police, or the diary was penned by an individual with mental health issues who sought information about the girl's abduction on the news and believed in a narrative being born in their mind. Nevertheless, detectives continued to hope that sooner or later, they would uncover the truth. However, no new leads emerged, and the case once again came to a standstill. In the summer of 2015, Kirsten's case was handed over to a new detective named Daryl Miller, who decided to initiate a fresh investigation. He studied all the existing documents and records, and at some point he noticed something peculiar. To his surprise, Miller realized that over all these years, his predecessors hadn't examined the crucial pieces of evidence: the blood on the windowsill in the victim's room and on her underwear. Although these pieces of evidence were stored in the warehouse for some inexplicable reason, they hadn't been sent to the lab for analysis. Perhaps, back then, the police thought the blood belonged to the girl, and analyzing it wouldn't yield any results. Miller decided to rectify this and sent the evidence to the lab. Soon, they called him back, stating that both blood samples belonged not to Kirsten but to an unknown male. This was a long-awaited breakthrough, but the detective faced a new challenge. The abductor's DNA sample was immediately uploaded to the FBI database, but there was no match. This could mean that he hadn't committed serious crimes or it happened before the database's creation. Nevertheless, Miller was undeterred. He decided to collect DNA samples from all the men involved in the case since the abduction. The police compiled a list, located each person, and sent their DNA to the lab. Surprisingly, every individual willingly provided their samples right away. This led investigators to consider that the murderer might have not been part of the case files. Despite this, Miller patiently awaited their results until he finally got a call from the lab. Experts had completed the analysis of one of the samples and found that it perfectly matched the blood found on the victim's windowsill and underwear. The individual was 56-year-old Anthony Palma, a neighbor of the Hatfield family who lived just across the street from them. Palma was one of the first people the police spoke to on the day of the abduction. Back then, he told them he woke up around 3 a.m. due to his dog barking. Now, with confirmation of his involvement, detectives decided to speak with them again. While DNA evidence was more than sufficient for a conviction in court, investigators hoped to extract a confession. Firstly, it would significantly expedite the trial, and secondly, only he knew where Kirsten's body was, making it nearly impossible to locate her remains without his cooperation. Detectives chose to proceed cautiously. They invited Anthony for questioning, stating it was a routine process. Supposedly, they were re-interviewing everyone, including neighbors, hoping to gather some new information. In reality, they had a specific task to get him to admit whether he had ever been inside the Hatfield family home. Initially, detectives asked if he remembered anything else from that night. Anthony recounted the same story as 18 years ago. However, this time he added a new detail. He allegedly saw a white car parked in front of Kirsten's house but didn't think much of it. Next, the police inquired about his familiarity with the girl and her family. Anthony said he knew them as neighbors but never interacted with Kirsten personally. He added that during those years, he got along well with other neighborhood kids. For instance, they occasionally asked him to fix their bikes or stop by for candy. Subsequently, the police asked if he had ever been inside Kirsten's house. Perhaps the girl's mother had asked him for help, or he had visited just to chat. However, Anthony claimed he had never been inside the house while the family lived there. For the detectives, this became a crucial moment for the interrogation. Considering the man's blood was found on the windowsill from the victim's room, they had just caught him in a lie. Thanks to this, in court, he wouldn't be able to claim that the blood got there under different circumstances, like when he visited the neighbors on another day. However, there was a problem. The house where Kirsten lived had previously belonged to Anthony's friend, and he admitted to visiting it during those years. But the blood sample on the windowsill was clearly fresh and couldn't have been left there many years ago. However, detectives decided to move on to the main part and informed him that his blood was found in Kirsten's room and on her underwear. Anthony began denying this repeating that he had never been inside their home. Investigators tried to extract a confession, but he consistently stuck to his denial. Then they opted to change tactics and left the room. Detective Miller entered to speak with Anthony. He brought along a photo of Kirsten, placing it on the table in front of the suspect. Anthony immediately pushed it away and avoided looking at the photo for the rest of the conversation. Miller asked him various questions, hoping Anthony would eventually slip up, but he continued to deny everything. Realizing they wouldn't extract a confession, the police decided to finish the interrogation and arrested the man. Following this, they obtained a search warrant for his house, thoroughly excavated the entire area, but couldn't find any trace of the girl's remains or any other evidence. During the trial, Anthony persisted in denying his involvement, but the results of the DNA analysis spoke for themselves. In court, additional details emerged that police had overlooked during the initial investigation. It turned out Anthony had prior run-ins with the law. Several years before Kirsten's abduction, he had intruded into another girl's bedroom and assaulted her. He had also been imprisoned in the 80s for a weapon-related attack. This further underscored Anthony's status as a dangerous criminal, but for some reason, his past convictions were overlooked in 1997. In late 2017, the jury found him guilty of Kirsten's abduction and murder, sentencing Anthony to life in prison. Throughout the trial, he never revealed the location of her remains, and the police doubt they'll ever find the girl. The problem lies in Anthony's employment with the park services. Familiar with remote areas, he could have buried the body where investigators might never reach. Nevertheless, the victim's mother persisted in trying to find her daughter. She regularly called Anthony and visited him in prison, spending hours seeking answers. With each interaction, she felt the criminal was getting closer to disclosing the body's whereabouts, but it never happened. In early 2019, Anthony was killed by his cellmate driven by personal animosity stemming from Anthony's crime against the child. As a result, the Kirsten family's sole hope to locate the girl's body rests on the chance that hunters or travelers may stumble upon it in remote national parks. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.